Section 24 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel, Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place names the place. Part 5. Thenceforward, having placed between herself on the one hand, and the staff of the hotel and its decorators on the other, the servants who bore instead of her the shock of contact with all this strange humanity, and kept up around their mistress her familiar atmosphere, having set her prejudices between herself and the other visitors, indifferent whether or not she gave offense to people whom her friends would not have had in their houses, it was in her own world that she continued to live, by correspondence with her friends, by memories, by her intimate sense of and confidence in her own position, the quality of her manners, the competence of her politeness. And every day when she came downstairs to go for a drive in her own carriage, the lady's maid who came after her carrying her wraps, the footmen who preceded her, seemed like sentries who, at the gate of an embassy, flying the flag of the country to which she belonged, assured to her upon foreign soil the privilege of extraterritoriality. She did not leave her room until late in the afternoon on the day following our arrival, so that we did not see her in the dining room, into which the manager, since we were strangers there, conducted us, taking us under his wing, as a corporal takes a squad of recruits to the master tailor to have them fitted. We did see, however, a moment later, a country gentleman and his daughter, of an obscure but very ancient Breton family, Monsieur and Mademoiselle de Stermaria, whose table had been allotted to us, in the belief that they had gone out and would not be back until the evening. Having come to Balbec only to see various country magnates whom they knew in that neighborhood, they spent in the hotel dining-room, what with the invitations they accepted and the visits they paid, only such time as was strictly unavoidable. It was their stiffness that preserved them intact from all human sympathy, from interesting at all the strangers seated round about them, among whom Monsieur de Stermaria kept up the glacial, preoccupied, distant, rude, punctilious, and distrustful air that we assume in a railway refreshment room, among fellow passengers whom we have never seen before and will never see again, and with whom we can conceive of no other relations than to defend from their onslaught our portion of cold chicken and our corner seat in the train. No sooner had we begun our luncheon than we were asked to leave the table on the instructions of Monsieur de Stermaria, who had just arrived, and, without the faintest attempt at an apology to us, requested the head waiter, in our hearing, to see that such a mistake did not occur again, for it was repugnant to him that people whom he did not know should have taken his table. And certainly into the feeling which impelled a young actress, better known though for her smart clothes, her smart sayings, her collection of German porcelain, than in the occasional parts that she had played at the Odeon, her lover, an immensely rich young man for whose sake she had acquired her culture, and two sprigs of aristocracy at that time much in the public eye, to form a little band apart, to travel only together, to come down to luncheon, when at Balbec, very late, after everyone had finished, to spend the whole day in their sitting-room playing cards, there entered no sort of ill humor against the rest of us, but simply the requirements of the taste that they had formed for a certain type of conversation, for certain refinements of good living, which made them find pleasure in spending their time, in taking their meals only by themselves, and would have rendered intolerable a life in common with people who had not been initiated into those mysteries. Even at a dinner or a card table, each of them had to be certain that in the diner or partner who sat opposite to him, there was, latent and not yet made use of, a certain brand of knowledge which would enable him to identify the rubbish with which so many houses in Paris were littered as genuine medieval or Renaissance pieces, and, whatever the subject of discussion, to apply the critical standards common to all their party, whereby they distinguished good work from bad. Probably it was only at such moments, by some infrequent amusing interruption flung into the general silence of meal or game, or by the new and charming frock which the young actress had put on for luncheon or for poker, that the special kind of existence in which these four friends desired above all things to remain plunged was made apparent. but by engulfing them thus in a system of habits which they knew by heart, it sufficed to protect them from the mystery of the life that was going on all round them. All the long afternoon the sea was suspended there before their eyes, only as a canvas of attractive coloring might hang on the wall of a wealthy bachelor's flat, and it was only in the intervals between the hands that one of the players, finding nothing better to do, raised his eyes to it to seek from it some indication of the weather or the time, and to remind the others that tea was ready. And at night they did not dine in the hotel, where, hidden springs of electricity flooding the great dining room with light, it became as it were an immense and wonderful aquarium against whose wall of glass the working population of Baalbec, the fishermen and also the tradesmen's families, clustering invisibly in the outer darkness, pressed their faces to watch, gently floating upon the golden eddies within, the luxurious life of its occupants. A thing as extraordinary to the poor as the life of strange fishes or mollusks. An important social question, this, whether the wall of glass will always protect the wonderful creatures at their feasting, whether the obscure folk who watch them hungrily out of the night will not break in some day to gather them from their aquarium and devour them. Meanwhile, there may have been, perhaps, among the gazing crowd, a motionless, formless mass, there in the dark, some writer, some student of human ichthyology, who, as he watched the jaws of old feminine monstrosities close over a mouthful of food which they proceeded then to absorb, was amusing himself by classifying them according to their race, by their innate characteristics, as well as by those acquired characteristics which bring it about that an old Serbian lady whose buccal protuberance is that of a great sea fish, because from her earliest years she has moved in the fresh waters of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, eats her salad for all the world like a la Rochefoucauld. At that hour one could see the three young men in dinner jackets waiting for the young woman, who was as usual late, but presently, wearing a dress that was almost always different and one of a series of scarves, chosen to gratify some special instinct in her lover, after having from her landing rung for the lift, would emerge from it like a doll coming out of its box. And then all four, because they found that the international phenomenon of the palace, planted on Baalbec soil, had blossomed there in material splendor rather than in food that was fit to eat, bundled into a carriage and went to dine, a mile off, in a little restaurant that was well spoken of, where they held with the cook himself endless discussions of the composition of their meal and the cooking of its various dishes. During their drive, the road bordered with apple trees that led out of Baalbec was no more to them than the distance that must be traversed, barely distinguishable in the darkness from that which separated their homes in Paris from the Café Anglais or the Tour de Gent, before they could arrive at the fashionable little restaurant where, while the young man's friends envied him because he had such a smartly dressed mistress, the latter's scarves were spread about the little company like a fragrant flowering veil, but one that kept it apart from the outer world. Alas, for my peace of mind, I had none of the detachment that all these people showed. To many of them I gave constant thought. I should have liked not to pass unobserved by a man with a receding brow and eyes that dodged between the blinkers of his prejudices and his education, the great nobleman of the district, who was none other than the brother-in-law of Legrandin, and came every now and then to see somebody at Baalbec, and on Sundays, by reason of the weekly garden party that his wife and he gave, robbed the hotel of a large number of its occupants, because one or two of them were invited to these entertainments, and the others, so as not to appear to have been not invited, chose that day for an expedition to some distant spot. He had had, as it happened, an exceedingly bad reception at the hotel on the first day of the season, when the staff, freshly imported from the Riviera, did not yet know who or what he was. Not only was he not wearing white flannels, but, with old-fashioned French courtesy, and in his ignorance of the ways of smart hotels, on coming into the hall in which there were ladies sitting, he had taken off his hat at the door, the effect of which had been that the manager did not so much as raise a finger to his own in acknowledgment, concluding that this must be some one of the most humble extraction, what he called sprung from the ordinary. The solicitor's wife alone had felt herself attracted by the stranger, who exhaled all the starched vulgarity of the really respectable, and had declared, with the unerring discernment and the indisputable authority of a person from whom the highest society of Le Monde had no secrets, that one could see at a glance that one was in the presence of a gentleman of great distinction, of perfect breeding, a striking contrast to the sort of people one usually saw at Balbec, whom she condemned as impossible to know so long as she did not know them. This favorable judgment which she had pronounced on Legrandine's brother-in-law was based, perhaps, on the spiritless appearance of a man about whom there was nothing to intimidate anyone. Perhaps also she had recognized in this gentleman farmer with the gait of a sacristan the Masonic signs of her own inveterate clericalism. It made no difference, my knowing that the young fellows who went past the hotel every day on horseback were the sons of the questionably solvent proprietor of a linen drapery, to whom my father would never have dreamed of speaking. The glamour of seaside life exalted them in my eyes to equestrian statues of demigods. And the best thing that I could hope for was that they would never allow their proud gaze to fall upon the wretched boy who was myself, who left the hotel dining-room only to sit humbly upon the sands. I should have been glad to arouse some response even from the adventurer who had been king of a desert island in the South Seas, even of the young consumptive, of whom I liked to think that he was hiding beneath his insolent exterior a shy and tender heart, which would perhaps have lavished on me, and on me alone, the treasures of its affection. Besides, unlike what one generally says of the people one meets when traveling, just as being seen in certain company can invest us, in a watering place to which we shall return another year, with a coefficient that has no equivalent in our true social life, so there is nothing, not which we keep so resolutely at a distance, but which we cultivate with such assiduity after our return to Paris as the friendships that we have formed by the sea. I was anxious about the opinion that might be held of me by all these temporary or local celebrities, whom my tendency to put myself in the place of other people, and to reconstruct what was in their minds, had made me place not in their true rank that which they would have held in Paris, for instance, and which would have been quite low, but in that which they must imagine to be, and which indeed was their rank at Balbec, where the want of common denominator gave them a sort of relative superiority and an individual interest. Alas, none of these people's contempt for me was so unbearable as that of Monsieur de Stermaria. For I had noticed his daughter the moment she came into the room, her pretty features, her pallid, almost blue complexion, what there was peculiar in the carriage of her tall figure, in her gait, which suggested to me, and rightly, her long descent, her aristocratic upbringing, all the more vividly because I knew her name, like those expressive themes composed by musicians of genius, which paint in splendid colors the glow of fire, the rush of water, the peace of fields and woods, to audiences who, having first let their eyes run over the program, have their imaginations trained in the right direction. The label Centuries of Breeding, by adding to Mademoiselle de Stermaria's charms the idea of their origin, made them more desirable also. Advertising their rarity as a high price enhances the value of a thing that has already taken our fancy. And its stock of heredity gave to her complexion, in which so many selected juices had been blended, the savor of an exotic fruit or of a famous vintage. And then mere chance put into our hands, my grandmother's and mine, the means of giving ourselves an immediate distinction in the eyes of all the other occupants of the hotel. On that first afternoon, at the moment when the old lady came downstairs from her room, producing, thanks to the footman who preceded her, the maid who came running after her with a book and a rug that had been left behind, a marked effect upon all who beheld her, and arousing in each of them a curiosity from which it was evident that none was so little immune as Monsieur de Stermaria. The manager leaned across to my grandmother and said, from pure kindness of heart, as one might point out the Shah or Queen Ranavalo to an obscure onlooker, who could obviously have no sort of connection with so mighty a potentate, but might be interested all the same to know that he had been standing within a few feet of one, whispered in her ear the Marquise de Villeparisis, while at the same moment the old lady, catching sight of my grandmother, could not repress a start of pleased surprise. It may be imagined that the sudden appearance in the guise of a little old woman of the most powerful of fairies would not have given me so much pleasure, destitute as I was of any means of access to Mademoiselle de Stermaria, in a strange place where I knew no one, that is to say, for any practical purpose. Aesthetically, the number of types of humanity is so restricted that we must constantly, wherever we may be, have the pleasure of seeing people we know, even without looking for them in the works of the old masters, like Swann. Thus it happened that in the first few days of our visit to Balbec, I had succeeded in finding La Grandine, Swann's hall porter, and Madame Swann herself, transformed into a waiter, a foreign visitor whom I never saw again, and a bathing superintendent. And a sort of magnetism attracts and retains so inseparably, one after another, certain characteristics, facial and mental, that when nature thus introduces a person into a new body she does not mutilate him unduly. La Grandine turned waiter kept intact his stature, the outline of his nose, part of his chin. Madame Swann, in the masculine gender and the calling of a bathing superintendent, had been accompanied not only by familiar features, but even by the way she had of speaking. Only, she could be of little, if any more use to me, standing upon the beach there in the red sash of her office, and hoisting at the first gust of wind the flag which forbade us to bathe. For these superintendents are prudent men, and seldom know how to swim. Than she would have been in that fresco of the life of Moses, in which Swann had long ago identified her in the portrait of Jethro's daughter. Whereas this Madame de Villeparisis was her real self. She had not been the victim of an enchantment which had deprived her of her power, but was capable, on the contrary, of putting at the service of my power an enchantment which would multiply it an hundredfold, and thanks to which, as though I had been swept through the air on the wings of a fabulous bird, I was to cross in a few moments the indefinitely wide, at least at Balbec, social gulf which separated me from Mademoiselle de Stermaria. Unfortunately, if there was one person in the world who, more than anyone else, lived shut up in a little world of her own, it was my grandmother. She would not indeed have despised me, she would simply not have understood what I meant had she been told that I attached importance to the opinions, that I felt an interest in the persons of people the very existence of whom she had never noticed, and would, when the time came to leave Balbec, retain no impression of their names. I dared not confess to her that if these same people had seen her talking to Madame de Villeparisis, I should have been immensely gratified, because I felt that the Marquise counted for much in the hotel, and that her friendship would have given us a position in the eyes of Mademoiselle de Stermaria. Not that my grandmother's friend represented to me, in any sense of the word, a member of the aristocracy. I was too well used to her name, which had been familiar to my ears before my mind had begun to consider it, when as a child I had heard it occur in conversation at home, while her title added to it only a touch of quaintness, as some uncommon Christian name would have done, or as in the names of streets, among which we can see nothing more noble in the Rue Lord Byron, in the plebeian and even squalid Rue Rocher-Chouart, or in the Rue Grammont, than in the Rue Léonce Reynaud, or the Rue Hippolyte Labas. Madame de Villeparisis no more made me think of a person who belonged to a special world than did her cousin MacMahon, whom I did not clearly distinguish from Monsieur Carnot, likewise President of the Republic, or from Raspail, whose photograph Francois had bought with that of Pius IX. It was one of my grandmother's principles that when away from home one should cease to have any social intercourse, that one did not go to the seaside to meet people, having plenty of time for that sort of thing in Paris, that they would make one waste on being merely polite, in pointless conversation, the precious time which ought all to be spent in the open air, beside the waves. And finding it convenient to assume that this view was shared by everyone else, and that it authorized, between old friends, whom chance brought face to face in the same hotel? The fiction of a mutual incognito? On hearing her friend's name from the manager, she merely looked the other way and pretended not to see Madame de Villaparisis, who, realizing that my grandmother did not want to be recognized, looked also into the void. She went past, and I was left in my isolation like a shipwrecked mariner who has seen a vessel apparently coming towards him, which has then, without lowering a boat, vanished under the horizon. She, too, had her meals in the dining room, but at the other end of it. She knew none of the people who were staying in the hotel, or who came there to call, not even Monsieur de Cambremer. In fact, I noticed that he gave her no greeting, one day when, with his wife, he had accepted an invitation to take luncheon with the barrister, who, drunken with the honor of having the nobleman at his table, avoided his friends of every day, and confined himself to a distant twitch of the eyelid, so as to draw their attention to this historic event, but so discreetly that his signal could not be interpreted by them as an invitation to join the party. "Well, I hope you've got on your best clothes. I hope you feel smart enough," was the magistrate's wife's greeting to him that evening. "Smart? Why should I?" asked the barrister, concealing his rapture in an exaggerated astonishment. "Because of my guests, do you mean?" he went on, feeling that it was impossible to keep up the farce any longer. "But what is there smart about having a few friends in to luncheon? After all, they must feed somewhere." "But it is smart. They are the de Camemberts, aren't they? I recognize them at once. She is a marquise, and quite genuine too, not through the females." "Oh, she is a very simple soul. She is charming, no standoffishness about her. I thought you were coming to join us. I was making signals to you. I would have introduced you," he asserted, tempering with a hint of irony the vast generosity of the offer, like Ahasuerus when he says to Esther, "Of all my kingdom must I give you half?" "No, no, no, no. We lie hidden like the modest violet." "But you were quite wrong, I assure you," replied the barrister, growing bolder now that the danger point was passed. "They weren't going to eat you. I say, aren't we going to have our little game of bezique?" "Why, of course. We were afraid to suggest it, now that you go about entertaining marquesses." "Oh, get along with you. There's nothing so very wonderful about them. Why, I'm dining there tomorrow. Would you care to go instead of me? I mean it. Honestly, I'd just as soon stay here." "No, no. I should be removed from the bench as a reactionary," cried the chief magistrate, laughing till the tears stood in his eyes at his own joke. "But you go to the Faterne too, don't you?" he went on, turning to the solicitor. "Oh, I go there on Sundays, in at one door and out at the other. But I don't have them here to luncheon like the leader." Monsieur de Stermaria was not at Balbec that day, to the barrister's great regret. But he managed to say a word in season to the head waiter. "Jaime, you can tell Monsieur de Stermaria that he's not the only nobleman you've had in here. You saw the gentleman who was with me today at luncheon, eh? A small mustache, looked like a military man? Well, that was the Marquis de Cambremer." "Was it indeed? I'm not surprised to hear it." "That will show him that he's not the only man who's got a title. That will teach him. It's not a bad thing to take 'em down a peg or two, those noblemen. I say, Jaime, don't say anything to him unless you like. I mean to say it's no business of mine. Besides, they know each other already." And next day Monsieur de Stermaria, who remembered that the barrister had once held a brief for one of his friends, came up and introduced himself. "Our friends in common, the de Cambremers, were anxious that we should meet. The days didn't fit. I don't know quite what went wrong," stammered the barrister, who, like most liars, imagined that other people do not take the trouble to investigate an unimportant detail which, for all that, may be sufficient, if chance puts you in possession of the humble facts of the case, and they contradict it, to show the liar in his true colors and to inspire a lasting mistrust. Then, as at all times, but more easily now that her father had left her and was talking to the barrister, I was gazing at Mademoiselle de Stermaria. no less than the bold and always graceful originality of her attitudes, as when, leaning her elbows on the table, she raised her glass in both hands over her outstretched arms, the dry flame of a glance at once extinguished, the ingrained congenital hardness that one could feel, ill concealed by her own personal inflections, in the sound of her voice, which had shocked my grandmother. A sort of atavistic starting point to which she recoiled whenever, by glance or utterance, she had succeeded in expressing a thought of her own. All of these qualities carried the mind of him who watched her back to the line of ancestors who had bequeathed to her that inadequacy of human sympathy, those blanks in her sensibility, that short measure of humanity which was at every moment running out. But from a certain look which flooded for a moment the wells, instantly dry again, of her eyes, a look in which I could discern that almost obsequious docility which the predominance of a taste for sensual pleasures gives to the proudest of women, who will soon come to recognize but one form of personal distinction, that namely which any man enjoys who can make her feel those pleasures, an actor, an acrobat even, for whom perhaps she will one day leave her husband, from a certain rosy tint, warm and sensual, which flushed her pallid cheeks, like the color that stained the hearts of the white water lilies in the Vivant. I thought I could discern that she would readily have consented to my coming to seek her in the savor of that life of poetry and romance which she led in Brittany, a life to which, whether from over-familiarity or from innate superiority, or from disgust at the penury or the avarice of her family, she seemed not to attach any great value, but which, for all that, she held enclosed in her body. In the meager stock of willpower that had been transmitted to her, and gave an element of weakness to her expression, she would not perhaps have found the strength to resist. And, crowned by a feather that was a trifle old-fashioned and pretentious, the gray felt hat which she invariably wore at meals made her all the more attractive to me, not because it was in harmony with her pearly or rosy complexion, but because, by making me suppose her to be poor, it brought her closer to myself. Obliged by her father's presence to adopt a conventional attitude, but already bringing to the perception and classification of the people who passed before her eyes other principles than his, perhaps she saw in me not my humble rank, but the right sex and age. If one day Monsieur de Sturmaria had gone out leaving her behind, if above all Madame de Villaparisis, by coming to sit at our table, had given her an opinion of me which might have emboldened me to approach her, perhaps then we might have contrived to exchange a few words, to arrange a meeting, to form a closer tie. And for a whole month during which she would be left alone, without her parents, in her romantic Breton castle, we should perhaps have been able to wander by ourselves at evening, she and I together in the dusk which would show in a softer light above the darkening water pink briar roses, beneath oak trees beaten and stunted by the hammering of the waves. Together we should have roamed that isle impregnated with so intense a charm for me, because it had enclosed the everyday life of Mademoiselle de Sturmaria, and lay at rest in her remembering eyes. For it seemed to me that I should not really have possessed her save there, when I should have traversed those regions which enveloped her in so many memories, a veil which my desire sought to tear apart, one of those veils which nature interposes between woman and her pursuers, with the same intention as when, for all of us, she places the act of reproduction between ourselves and our keenest pleasure, and for insects places before the nectar the pollen in which they must carry away with them, in order that, tricked by the illusion of possessing her thus more completely, they may be forced to occupy first the scenes among which she lives, and which, of more service to their imagination than sensual pleasure can be, yet would not without that pleasure have had the power to attract them. End of section 24.